And of course, remember after here, we retire downstairs for refreshments. The key announcement is there are refreshments sponsored by some local companies. So thank you to all of them. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Phil Hirsch today, who counts, he officially wins the award for traveling the longest distance for this seminar series. He comes to us from Australia, from Sydney, via London, where he did his PhD at...
So is it the University of London?
University of London, that makes very much sense. He has broad interests in geopolitics and water, and has done all sorts of interesting things, especially as it relates to the Mekong region, which you'll talk about today, in the Mekong. So, Phil, welcome.
Well, thanks, Ken. Thanks. I mean, it's a huge pleasure to be here for all sorts of reasons, despite the distance it takes to get here. One is thanks to Chad and the many others I've met today for really stimulating conversations, and also, I guess, inspiration in the way you think about water resources. Not so much from a policy, but from a politics point of view. And I should have said also another reason for my pleasure at being here is to be here, if not to meet. Another way of framing questions is to sort of ask perhaps deeper questions about power. What kind of configurations of power with different configurations of weak upstream and strong downstream, or strong upstream and weak downstream countries determine who gets what. And another is then to ask what the nature of that power is. Is it out and out political and economic power, or is there, I guess, a more subtle hegemonic power of ideas that determines outcomes in basins? And then another is to look somewhat critically at many of these models and ideas, and to ask, well, is this really an issue between states, or do we need to look at a more societal level, look at non-state actors? So, but all of these models tend to frame the questions around the interplay between power, conflict, and cooperation. What I'd like to do today relates to these, but I'd like to frame the question somewhat differently, and to explore. This isn't something I've written and published on. It's actually, if you like, thinking and work in progress, but explore geopolitics through the question of what these geopolitics are that lie behind decisions that seem to run counter to scientific advice, to knowledge, to received wisdom, particularly in an international river basin like the Mekong, which has put a lot of investment over a long period of time into scientific assessment, into modelling, and yet where the decisions, clearly are not necessarily following the implications of what we know about what's appropriate in the basin. So I'll do this briefly with a few thoughts about the interplay between knowledge and policy, science and politics in international river basin management, looking at how society comes in as well. And then I'll give a bit of background about the Mekong, the way in which the Mekong has been made as an arena of decision making and as a political arena, and including a bit of sort of basic factual background about the way in which the very fraught geopolitics of the region from the 1950s onwards really needs to be understood to look at what we're facing today. And then talk about the agenda of developing large-scale hydropower on the mainstream, on the main stem of the Mekong, or the Lancang-Mekong River. The river is known as the Lancangjiang in China. And I'll try to bring that all together through the case of the very first dam, this one here, that is being built on the main stem of the lower Mekong River after somewhat 56 years of studies and discussion to try to encourage dams to get built on the lower mainstream. The very first one is now being built on the river, much to many people's alarm, both for what the dam is, but also in terms of what it will lead to more widely, and then reflect a bit on the politics through that. So I'm going to move fairly fast. I'd like to leave time for questions and discussion, but feel free to jump in and stop me if you like along the way. So the first issue is how we look at the relationship, at the role of geopolitics. And one is, of course, to question the Saralgeddon idea of the wars of the 21st century being fought over water, unlike the 20th century wars fought over oil, and the Vandana Shiva sort of water wars idea, and to say, well, in fact, people of course quarrel over water, but ultimately they tend to get together and find ways to cooperate more than others, and that's the work which perhaps a number of, I don't know if some of these authors are in the room, but which are written about suggesting that there's a tendency towards international cooperation over water, which is more prevalent than conflict. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. Where am I? Here we go. Another framework broadly in the area of hydropolitics is the notion of Hydra Hegemony, which is to say, well, in fact, if we're looking at the issue of water and relationships between different countries in the international river basin, we need to understand the configuration, whether it's a basin where the powerful countries at the top, like in the Tigris Euphrates, with Turkey at the top and Iran at the bottom, or whether it's a basin like the Nile, where the powerful country is at the bottom. That these things matter, geographical positions matter, but also that the power is not just based on military power or on the size of the country or on economic prowess, but it's also based on the power of ideas, if you like, on discursive power. There's a critique of this which is, I guess, best exemplified actually through a nice but somewhat complex article written by Chris Sneddon and Colleen Fox, which says that these kinds of approaches to understanding transboundary river basin management focus too much on the transboundary and fail to take a more nuanced multi-scalar approach. And to examine the societal processes and also the way in which conflicts don't tend to be manifested so much in the abstract questions of agreements as around particular sites, particular nodes, as they put it, and call for a look at conflict and understanding the nuanced politics around particular projects. In fact, what I'm going to be doing with Xayaburi, the Xayaburi Dam case, is to look at how we can take a particular project and then draw outwards from that, rather than seeing it as a kind of subset of the configurations of power at a broader transnational level. This particular picture comes from currently, apart from Xayaburi, one of the most sort of troubling, and from both a social and ecological point of view, I would say dangerous hydropower development in the lower Mekong basin, which is not on the Mekong mainstream, it's on a tributary of the Mekong in Cambodia. It's the lower Se San 2 dam, and I'll point it out when we come to maps, where a wealthy Cambodian investor is being joined by Chinese and Vietnamese companies to build a dam on a river, and currently the clearing of the reservoir area is going on with a lot of threats to local people. And then, of course, we're talking about the science of dam building. There are the various science-based models or approaches to trying to come up with a framework for decision-making, either around individual projects, so the environmental and social impact assessment processes, or through cumulative assessment, a process which is often managed through institutions, because it's difficult to to carry out a cumulative assessment for each, for the incremental effects of each individual project, which looks at the, for example, the macro hydrological changes over and above the individual incremental implications of any particular dam. And then there are processes that have been going on in the Mekong of strategic assessment, which looks at the approach not so much from the point of view of the impacts of dams, but looks in terms of what the ultimate aims of the dam building agenda is in terms of power production, flood control, irrigation development, and ask whether, in fact, these are the best ways to achieve such aims. And I'll talk about a particular strategic environmental assessment process in the Mekong, which has been an important component in the politics of the Xayaburi Dam. And then there's an attempt to pull all these together into various integrative frameworks, the IWRM framework. I've sort of put this up as a reminder that Francois Moll has described such concepts as nirvana concepts, as concepts which have a kind of aspirational logic to themselves, but ultimately which are not related much to the real world, and have the risk of being concepts that can allow institutions to frame business as usual in particular ways to achieve their own agendas. Anyway, let's come on to the Mekong to become more specific. So the Mekong is one of the current hotspots of hydropower development as a transboundary basin, in part because there's such a large scale agenda for dam building, in part because it is an international river basin with big differences in the positions of countries and positions of different groups within those countries on dam building. But it's also a basin which, compared with most, has got a particularly long institutional history, which is tightly bound up with the changing geopolitics of the region. In 1957, the Mekong Committee was established nominally under the auspices of the United Nations, but with a very heavy input from the United States through the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers, and essentially was established as an institution that was to provide stability, growth, prosperity in the area as part of the geostrategic way of containing communism. I kind of like this National Geographic cover from December 1968, which talks about the Mekong as a river of terror and hope, the terror being the communist menace at the time, the hope being the hope that the river could be dammed, rather like the Columbia, from top to bottom, and provide power, prosperity, and deal with or preempt the sort of rural insurgency that was going on at the time. It's a fascinating read inside the covers of that particular journal. So this was a time when there was great faith, of course, in large dams. Some of the critique that's emerged since was not there, and this was seen as the answer. The work of the Mekong Committee right through the 1960s and to the 1970s was largely on paper. A great deal of money, I think, in nominal terms, $400 million, which is worth much more in current dollars, was spent on various studies and plans. In 1970, an indicative plan was established for a cascade of dams on the lower Mekong, which would have seen the river as a series of high dams, a series of stepped lakes, more or less from the point at which the river exits China to the point at which it meets its delta in central Cambodia. None of these dams ever got built because of the geopolitical conflict because of the Cold War, or hot war as it was in the region. And in the 1970s, the Mekong Committee essentially was disbanded. It was when Cambodia withdrew during the Khmer Rouge period. It got disbanded. It was re-established as the interim Mekong Committee in 1978, but not very much happened for a period of time. When it was when discussion started to occur for reconvening the committee in the late 1980s, with the end of the Cold War and the regional rapprochement as Thailand's economy was booming and Thailand was meeting its own eco-political limits. Dams in Thailand had started to become hot issues, and a very significant one, the Nam Jon Dam, had been cancelled in 1988 as a result of environmentalist pressure. Thailand took advantage of the improved relationship with its neighbours through a famous statement by the then Prime Minister, Chanchay Chunawat. We want to turn the battlefields into marketplaces. And at that time, the idea of reconvening the interim Mekong Committee as a full Mekong Committee again and getting these dams back on the agenda came in. But of course, in the intervening time, the understandings of dams, the earlier sort of writings on the environmental and social impacts of dams by Nicholas Gilliard and Teddy Goldsmith, and the work of the International Rivers Network as it had arisen then, and many others, meant that many of the dam plans which had been dusted off, there was a kind of revision of the indicative plan that had been drawn up in the 1970s, and it was sort of republished in 1987. It immediately raised the hackles, and this became a big issue. But it remained also a geopolitical issue, in that in the initial attempt to reconvene the Mekong Committee as the Mekong River Commission in 1992, the whole thing fell apart because Vietnam and Thailand couldn't agree on the rules. Vietnam, as a downstream country, essentially wanted a veto right, whereas Thailand wanted a much more open-ended agreement, and the thing fell apart. Eventually, though, in 1995, an agreement was signed, the Agreement for the Cooperation for Sustainable Development of the Mekong River Basin, and as part of this, the Mekong River Commission was established. But as the previous Mekong Committee had been, it was not a full river basin commission, in the sense that it only incorporated the 4 lower Mekong countries. In the 1950s, the reason for that was largely that China was simply out of the political fold, and with the US influence there was no way that China was going to become involved. By 1995, although China was invited in, China was just at the start of its massive dam building program on the upper Mekong, on the Lanchanjiang, and had very little incentive to become involved, not only as the more powerful a country, but also as the one which had least interest in being circumscribed in any kind of way in its own plans. It was established through the Mekong River Commission Secretariat, which initially was located in Bangkok at the same place as the old Mekong Committee Secretariat had been, with many of the same old staff. Many NGOs at the time saw this as old wine in a new bottle, a phrase that was put around a lot. But it did have a different character. First of all, because instead of being a UN agency, it was owned by the 4 riparian countries. While it was owned by the 4 riparian countries and continues to be governed by a council which comprises the key ministers, 1 minister from each of the 4 countries, and the joint committee, who are the permanent secretaries at the head of the responsible government agency in each of the 4 countries. And while there are national Mekong committees, which in principle are the conduit between the Transboundary Basin Commission and the countries themselves. Despite all of this ownership, it continues to be a commission that depends for about 90% of its funding on international donors. And so there's been an important and difficult tension between what the donor priorities are, for most of its lifetime, the key donors have been Scandinavian donors with environmental concerns. The sustainability issue has been the key one. And then the government agencies that represent each of the countries on the committee and on the councils, many of which have been sort of pushing for and expecting from the MRC that it help the hydropower development. So there's been a bit of a tension here. The other I guess the other sort of key aspect of the Mekong River Commission is that, at least in principle, it's based in an era where stakeholders are taken into account, and yet in its formal structures, it's based very much around countries as the stakeholders. So here's the basic structure, where you've got the governments of the 4 countries, and then it's managed through the council, managed through the joint committee, and the day-to-day work happens at the MRC Secretariat, which is where most of the activity, most of the hydrological modelling, study of fisheries, environmental program, the knowledge management program, and so on take place. And you've got the national committees on the side, and the donors group on the other side.
Quick question. You
Sure.
mentioned there were 6 countries that were touching the Mekong, but only 4 countries are on this commission.
Yes.
Does that lack of participation of those other 2 countries form a political situation for them?
It does, yes, and one of the big issues, well, now the 2 countries initially were totally out of it. Now Myanmar or Burma, and which has a very, very small part in the basin, but much more importantly, China, are observers, and they have observer status. They're dialogue partners, and they have been China's been releasing a bit more data than it had in the past, but is still very secretive about data, and attends meetings, but it's a difficult relationship. A lot of the public presentation is that there's cooperation for the first time, but it's quite limited. And as I'll come on to show, that's important given what China's been doing on the basin. So it's based around this agreement with 40-something articles, and importantly, the agreement has progressively, very slowly but progressively, been elaborated from a really broad-based agreement that can be interpreted in any number of ways to one with particular guidelines on and procedures, not laws, not rules, but procedures which countries in principle are bound to stick by. And the one I'll be talking about with regard to the dam, which has been really a test case for this, are the procedures for notification, prior consultation and agreement. And I'd argue this is the sort of key political process relevant to an agency like this, because it works to a set of rules that says there are particular types of projects that either need to be notified, where the country that's going ahead with them notifies the other countries through the MRC that they're going ahead, and that's it basically. They tell the countries what they're doing. Or there needs to be prior consultations, there needs to be some kind of dialogue process, or there needs to be agreement, which in effect means a veto process. But the requirements for agreement are so stringent that there's no conceivably buildable project that would require agreement. So the strongest level of interaction between the countries that gets triggered by any one country is prior consultation, and the project I'll be talking about is the very first one to require this prior consultation, with again the sort of open-ended and ambiguous nature of what that actually means, and the sort of highly political way in which it plays its way out. There's been a lot of critique of the MRC, including some work that I've done with colleagues at University of Sydney, but also through a report that we did together with the MRC's largest donor, that's the Danish development agency, Danida, where we carried out a look at transboundary water governance in the Mekong, but largely focused on the MRC framework. And one of the areas of critique is a rather ambiguous and different ways in which different stakeholders sort of work with the MRC, but are expecting very different things from it. There are some NGOs, for example, who criticize the MRC for not being powerful enough, for not its role enough when there are transboundary impacts. There was a big case in the late 1990s, early 2000s when impacts on indigenous communities in northeastern Cambodia that came from dam development in Vietnam at the Yali Falls Dam were making themselves felt, and the MRC was doing nothing. So the NGOs asked, what, you know, is this a paper tiger? Is it a toothless tiger if it's not actually doing anything? But the MRC doesn't actually have any sort of strict regulatory role in this sense. It sets certain procedures and rules, but it doesn't ultimately have any decision-making power. Also questions related to that, whether the MRC is, as some understand it, as a supranational agency, a governing agency, or whether it's one which is ultimately governed by its constituent partners, which is largely the case. The extent to which it's a stakeholder platform is a difficult question, given that on the one hand the MRC has become increasingly open in terms of information management compared to its earlier existence, and has incorporated some NGOs, but it's also been one that's been very selective in its NGO incorporation. So, for example, the civil society partners in the MRC are not NGOs that have a social base in any one of the member countries. They're the World Conservation Union, IUCN, and WWF, which are basically international NGOs, which goes to reinforce the idea and the sense and the reality that a lot of discussions are being held by foreign partners and foreign actors, working, of course, with their local partners in some cases. And then there's, of course, the idea that the MRC is a knowledge-based agency, which it certainly is. There's been proliferation of very important knowledge about fisheries, about environment, hydrological modelling, increasingly, though rather late in the day, understanding of sediment flux in the basin and the implications of dams for all of that. But there's a very, very weak, if any, link between the knowledge side of things and the decision-making process. So in principle, there's a decision support system, but there are very weak and rather ineffective ways of linking the two. But increasingly, the leadership of the Mekong River Commission Secretariat has been trying to deal with these issues, although the leadership has sort of fluctuated between those that are much more gung-ho, dam at all costs, to those that are much more environmentally concerned. And that's also been troublesome for some of the riparian governments, not quite knowing what to expect from the MRC. So the question of ownership is another issue there, as the MRC has continued to be donor supported and therefore perceived, at least, as donor driven. Of course, with the complex ecology or hydroecology of the Mekong, it's about a lot more than the science of dams and fish. But if we look at what the most controversial projects have boiled down to, this is where a lot of the ultimate debate ends up. The reason being that it's extremely difficult, or one reason being that it's extremely difficult in a part of the world where two of the countries, at least, Laos and Cambodia, are still among the least developed countries. It's difficult to frame arguments about dams or other development projects in straight environmental terms, in pure scientific and environmental terms. These are countries that need to develop to create value from whatever resources they have. They're also both extremely resource-dependent economies, growing rapidly, 7 to 8% annual growth in each of these countries, but almost entirely based on the resource base, and so the governments are concerned. But when it comes to the fishery, the Mekong is the world's largest freshwater fishery. According to the statistics produced by the studies done through the fisheries program, the annual freshwater catch is about 2.5 million tonnes per year, and if you add aquaculture into that, it's 3 million tonnes per year. To put that in context, the total recorded freshwater catch of according to the FAO statistics, around the world is about 15 million tons. So we're looking at 15–20% of the total freshwater catch being recorded in just one river basin. More importantly, even than that, is the fact that in the two poorest countries, in Laos and Cambodia, most of the rural population depends for anything from 50 to 80% of its animal protein in its diet from capture fisheries. And that means that anything that threatens the fishery has poverty-inducing effects, which means that the relationship between environment and development, which is often portrayed and understood rather simplistically as a trade-off either or, is complicated by the fact that if we're talking about development that destroys the fishery, we can see that it's development for some clearly at the expense of others. Of course, I'm sure some of you are aware that the Mekong houses some monsters which are not the basis of the fishery. We've got the giant catfish here, which grows up to 300 kilograms or 600 and something pounds. The giant stingray, similar size. These are enormous fish. The higher value fish that are caught, not quite this big. There are not many of these caught anymore, but the higher value fish are often 20, 50, 70 kilograms in size. So these are large fish. The bulk of the fishery, though, is in much smaller species. The Mekong is the world's largest fishery. It's also the second most biodiverse river in the world in terms of ichthyofauna. The number of species is still not known. They're discovering new ones every year, but it could be up to 1,700. There are something like 1,200 that have already been recorded in the system. If you take both the fish in the species in the freshwater part of the river and also those in the tidal areas. And as you know, I don't need to go through this in a group like this. The dams are the biggest single threat to the fishery. There's a continuing debate, and it's a politicised as well as scientific debate on the extractive versus environmental threats to the fisheries. There is certainly overfishing, there's use of illegal fishing gears and so on. But in terms of permanent impacts on the system, it's dams which have the biggest impact through the barrier effects, where most of the species are migratory in both longitudinal terms up and down the river, sometimes over hundreds or even more than 1,000 kilometers, but also importantly in lateral terms, moving between the river and the floodplain at different stages of their life cycle, and dams have impacts both in preventing fish movement up and down. Unlike the Columbia River salmon, a fish like this doesn't do very well on a fish ladder, and there are also impacts as in fact, one of the promised environmental benefits of dams that some of the Chinese dam builders put forward is that they help to even out the seasonal flow between wet season and dry season, which is nice for some, but not very nice for fish, which need the connection with the floodplain when the river overspilled its banks. There's a very, very close correlation between the size of the flood and the size of the fish catch in any one year in the Mekong and many other tropical river basins. Coming to what's actually planned for the river, and I'll speed up a little bit here to get to Xayaburi. As I said, the plan's been driven by geopolitics one way or another all the way along, with the geopolitics of the Cold War driving the early plans for development of the basin, the demise of the dams after 1975 were also forced by geopolitics. It was with the conflict in Vietnam and Laos, and then continuing in Cambodia right through to 1991. It was more or less impossible to get anything going on the mainstream. But rather to the surprise of many who thought that the era of giant dam building was over, and in the Mekong context it was definitely over for the mainstream, if not perhaps for the tributaries. There's been a revival. So the revival is from away from this profile, which was the original profile envisaged by the old Mekong Committee, towards what are termed run-of-river dams. Again, a sort of somewhat slippery and controversial notion in themselves, but the idea was that these are low-head dams, more of them, but where the retention time of water in the dams is much shorter than in the reservoirs. Most of them stay within the full bank level, so there's much less resettlement and so on. But nevertheless, they have important barrier and other effects. If we want to look at the extent of the dams that are being put forward, this is a map that was just put out by the, International Rivers, showing the plans for, or the existing dams in the upper reaches of China's international rivers, including the Nujiang or the Salaween River, and the Lanchangjiang or the Zhashu River in Tibet. And this is the upper Mekong. 24 dams above the cascade of 7 dams that are already being built. So in effect we see a river that's going to be a series of stepped lakes. I just heard that we've got someone in the room who's visited the uppermost of those dams in Qinghai province on the plateau where the Mekong River has its source. But while these are large in number, they're relatively small in head height. The really important ones in China are the 7 out of the 8 originally envisaged dams that are being built on the Lanchangjiang in Yunnan province in southwestern China, and which include 2 of the world's largest high-head dams, including the Xiaowan Dam that was finished 2 years ago, which has a dam crest height of 300 meters, or nearly 1,000 feet, and the Nuajadu, which has just been completed, although the turbines are still being installed, which has a only slightly lower head, but it's even larger in terms of reservoir capacity. Some have termed these the cistern dams, the dams that are really going to control the lower mainstream flows. And these are the only dams on the mainstream that are large enough in size individually to have a significant effect all the way down the system in terms of the changing the hydrological regime. China's been back low dams have been back on the agenda for a number of reasons, and I think some of you discussed an article that I sent out which gives some of these reasons. In your PhD discussion group, I think you talked about this today. But just very briefly, some of the reasons why the dams have come back somewhat surprisingly are, first of all, that the big storage dams in China are, ironically for some, change the economics of the low-head run-of-river dams considerably, because when the dams were originally envisaged as big storage dams on the lower Mekong, they made some economic sense from an hydroengineering point of view, at least, in the sense that they could store water in the wet season and release it in the dry. The run-of-river dams cannot do that, and so they really only operate to full capacity for, say, 4 or 5 months of the year. But when you have a dry season release from the Chinese dams, it increases the flows on the lower part of the river by anything up to 40–50%. It changes the economics of the dams further downstream considerably. So you start to see the linkage between the logics of what goes on upstream and downstream. Also, China has a role, of course, in building its own dams, but also in investing in dams. About 40% of all of the mainstream and 100 and something tributary dams that are scheduled for construction in Laos and Cambodia are funded by China. 40% would be funded by Chinese banks and built by Chinese construction companies, and in the most case actually physically built by Chinese workers imported for that purpose. There's also a political logic, and this sort of comes to one of the points I want to leave with at the end, and that is that the countries downstream, particularly Laos, which has predicated its economic growth and economic future largely on hydropower development, not for its own use, it's already an exporter, but for selling power to Thailand, as it has been doing for the last 40 years, and down the track to Vietnam and later to China. Laos is understandably saying, well, if the Chinese are building up there, why can't we build down here? The difference, one of the differences is that China is outside the MRC framework. Laos has to consult with its neighbours. And then there's the climate change logic that brings dams back onto the global agenda as countries seek for alternatives to fossil fuels, despite the debates that exist about the production of methane by rotting vegetation and so on, but there's been an impetus there, at least a discursive logic in bringing dams back onto the agenda. And of course just the enormous economic growth that's come with regional economic integration in the region, the opening up of previous command economies to market economies, which has increased energy demand. The major impacts of these dams we've already talked about. And one of the questions that comes up here is, given the impact that we know, the modelling suggests that there will be anything up to a 40% loss of fisheries just from the mainstream dams alone, which, given the dependence of the poorest of the poor in rural parts of Laos and Cambodia, northeastern Thailand and Vietnam, has major social effects. The question of whether this is worth it. On the one hand, we have the argument that building dams preempts the need to build coal-fired or nuclear-powered power stations. On the other hand, if we look at the contribution of all the mainstream dams, according to the Mekong River Commission's own figures, by 2030, if all 11 dams proposed for the lower Mekong were to be completed, they would contribute about 6% of the total power demand of Thailand and Vietnam, which sounds in some ways like quite a lot. But when we look at the projections on which such figures are arrived at, this is a region where the annual growth in power demand is 7 to 8%. So we're actually looking at these dams providing, at best, less than 1 year's growth in demand. So it raises some philosophical questions about what's necessary and how we think of alternatives. I'm going to perhaps just sort of skim over this, except to say that the mainstream hydropower has been assessed in all sorts of ways, from the World Bank's assessment, which has produced early on an argument that informed the Mekong River Commission's Basin Development Strategy, which was very much in favour of building at least the upper suite of dams on the lower Mekong, the ones that are above Vientiane in Laos, on the basis that if we look at the hydrological models, because they're run-of-river dams, they don't actually affect the hydrographs way down in the delta and way down in the Great Lake in Cambodia very much. But this is largely hydrologically driven. If we look at the question of sediment flows and sediment capture, fisheries impacts, we find something different. And that's where exercises like the strategic environmental assessment that was commissioned by the MRC and carried out by, in fact, an Australian company, came up with a much more sort of precautionary set of recommendations from the Basin Development Plan, which is also based on the same MRC data and science. So we see quite different conclusions being reached from the same science. And the SEA, which was published in October 2010, made a firm recommendation to put all construction of mainstream dams on hold for at least 10 years, in effect a moratorium until we understood the system better or had alternative technologies and so on. Partly as an outcome of this, USAID funded Portland State University to do a sensitivity analysis and to take these different sets of recommendations, outcome scenarios coming from the same bits of science, and say, well, how much of our conclusion depends on our assumptions. For example, the assumption on the value of fish, the assumption of the discount rate that we're taking when we're looking at the present and the future value of dams. And they use the same, in fact, the same basic calculator as the BDP used, the Basin Development Plan used, which is the net present value. And what they found is that if you tweak a few of the assumptions, rather than come up with the most optimistic assumption, which the Basin Development Plan strategy had, which is that looking at all the costs and benefits, we could come up with a net $29 billion net present value from all these dams. If you tweak a few of these, you could have a net present value of minus $290 billion. And this is important politically as well, because what drives the governments of the region ultimately to go ahead with dams is economic development. But if you're creating negative growth by taking into account all the lost fisheries and other environmental benefits, then we see a different set of consideration. I'm going to go over this. Okay, finally, the Xayaburi Dam. The Xayaburi Dam, as I said, is the very first one on the mainstream. It's a medium-sized dam. It's 32 meters high. It's 1,285 megawatt dam, which puts it at sort of medium level. It's in Laos, but I ask why it's a Thai or a Lao dam, because it's entirely it's 95% of its power would be sent to Thailand. The investors of the dam are Thai companies, and the 4 banks financing the dam are all Thai banks. This has been another major change in the political considerations around dams. In the past, most of the dams were public utilities funded by international public agencies like the World Bank and ADB. Now all of the projects that are going ahead are private. They're corporate investments. But of course, the Lao government receives a resource rent, and the revenues and to some extent the local multipliers of economic growth. The configuration of the dam is here, and the dam now includes a fish pass, which is also highly controversial, a prevailing sort of sentiment among fishery scientists who work in the Mekong region, is that there's no proven technology even on tributaries for anything higher than about 6 meters for fish to pass. And I think there are 229 species that are known to pass through this stretch of the Mekong, 40-something of which are endangered by any impoundment. And there's also now a provision for sediment flushing, which I was talking earlier on with Desiree about this as a provision. It's a dam that was assessed as is required, but the environmental assessment was done in a hurry. It was finished in 2010. The assessment is restricted to the immediate on-site assessments and looks at impacts up to 10 kilometers downstream, no further, which is an issue in its own right. It's been assessed, if you like, socially somewhat differently by different groups. This is a photograph of Thai fishers and NGOs staging themselves very strategically opposite the recently finished International Conference Centre on the Laos side of the border. This picture is taken from the Thai side of the Mekong River, advertising their opposition to the Xayaburi Dam. But as I said, this is the very first dam that has not been dealt with just in country with notification, but required and triggered the prior consultation requirement. And this meant that there was a process put in train by the requirements under the procedures that the MRC set for itself to both do scientific assessment of the evaluation of the assessments and a riparian consultation. There were 7 town hall style meetings. There were consultation meetings, 3 in Thailand, 2 in Vietnam, and 2 in Cambodia. There was no consultation held in Laos itself. The Lao government's position was the EIA took care of that, and basically took care of a survey. During the 6-month consultation period between September 2010 and March 2011, the EIA was still secret. It was not released, and so the consultation was over something where there was hadn't been full disclosure of information, and increasingly, very interestingly, the media. Quite predictably in Thailand and Cambodia, which have more open media, but more surprisingly in Vietnam, which has a very tightly controlled government media, were vehemently opposed to this dam. So this was the first time where in Vietnam, which is in effect, or has in effect been the political patron of Laos, where they're both one-party communist states, where the two parties are very close and where Laos tends to do what Vietnam wants. These two countries very publicly disagreed. And in the Crunch meeting in April 2011 of the Joint Committee that was supposed to reflect on the consultation that had involved both the scientific assessments and the consultation process, the Joint Committee members couldn't come to an agreement. And this is in an area of the world where international politics has traditionally dictated what's sometimes called the ASEAN way. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The ASEAN way is non-interference. You don't criticize what your neighbors are doing. So this was really a new scenario. The way in which it was dealt with was that the decision was deflected to the next council meeting, which means ministerial level. It went from the bureaucratic to the ministerial level, and that was 7 months hence in December, or 8 months hence in December 2011. But during this time, it became quite clear that Laos was proceeding with all the site preparation work and so on. The Vietnamese media went completely silent, and the only interpretation was that they were sort of behind-the-scene meetings at the top party level. But the Cambodians became sort of emboldened by Vietnam's written stance in its response to the prior consultation, became increasingly outspoken and even threatened to take Laos to the international court. So this, again, is a new sort of a new situation in Mekong politics. The council meeting in December 2011 recommended that everything be put on hold and further studies be carried out, but Laos continued to build. Ultimately, as Cambodia became more outspoken in its threats, and as things were going on behind the scenes in Vietnam, the Laos said, well, we're just doing site preparation work, we're not putting anything in the river. We believe the prior consultation is over, but we respect our neighbours. In November 2012, Laos hosted the largest international meeting it's ever held, the Asia-European meeting. 50 heads of state were in Laos, and Laos invited the Vietnamese and the Cambodian and the Thai representatives there to go to a groundbreaking ceremony for the start of construction of the Xayaburi Dam, and they went along. And that was it, and it's going ahead. So ultimately, Laos has got its way. Now you can ask, if we go by the rather sort of one-dimensional and conventional ideas of geopolitics, this doesn't add up. Why is the smallest, weakest, poorest country in the region getting its way over all these others? And a lot has to do with the the role of China as Vietnam and China are increasingly competitive for influence in both Laos and Vietnam. We see China not directly intervening in the decision, but rather giving the opportunity for Laos to go its own way. Why is Vietnam so concerned about the Xayaburi Dam? Well, at one level, you can say it's because and this is an important level. You can say it's because the Mekong Delta is in Vietnam. It supplies half of Vietnam's rice crop, and its entire surplus, which makes it the second largest rice exporter in the world. This is a country which just 1 generation ago was subject to famine as this concern. It's also a part of Vietnam which is entirely dependent on continuing sediment delivery, and anything like the cascade of dams that are being proposed and the predicted sediment capture of those dams threatens not only Vietnam's farmland, but literally its national territory as seawater encroaches with all the saline intrusion problems and so on. Why should they be concerned about Xayaburi? It's only one relatively sort of medium-sized dam a long way away. Well, it's not so much the Xayaburi Dam itself they're concerned about, but it's the trigger effect that this has. The logic of Xayaburi is that once one dam is in place, it's extremely difficult to see the other dams not going ahead. In part because the really destructive ones are, in terms of fisheries and sediment capture, are not in Laos, they're in Cambodia. And just as Laos is asking, well, if the Chinese are doing it, why can't we? It's hard to imagine a scenario whereby the dam built in, one dam or 3 dams or 5 dams built in Laos would not very quickly lead Hun Sen and his government in Cambodia, who are going full speed ahead with sort of individually even more destructive dams than Xayaburi on the lower Se San River. It's hard to imagine them foregoing development in their own country. So there's the logic where if you've got one dam, you've basically got them all, and that's what the Vietnamese are really concerned about. So I guess just to wrap up with a few reflections, and I must apologise for going somewhat over time. There's the question of sort of, you know, what are the geopolitics and other levels of politics that determine how and why decisions get made in the way they are. One is a disembedding of science, particularly in an agency which is funded internationally, which is sort of little enmeshed in the national agencies or societal concerns and debates in the countries where it's working. There's also the way in which the politics of dams are embedded within a much more complex political history and current situation in the region. But there's also, and this is I guess an idea that I'm trying to sort of develop and elaborate, the sort of political, economic and environmental logics that you might see in terms of path dependence. That we can see Xayaburi as having, those run-of-river mainstream dams as effectively having got their momentum as a result of China's construction of its dams, the changing geopolitical relationship between Laos and Vietnam and Laos and China on the other hand, Thailand's political interest in working with Laos because it's the beneficiary of the power and also the investment returns that come with investment. And where I say Thailand, this is Thai companies, it's not Thailand as a whole. The opposition also comes within Thailand. So we can see, but we can also see the political logics of countries then finding it very difficult to say no to one set of projects when they've said yes to another. So there's, if you like, the moral political logic that if those countries up there have done it, why can't we? There's the economic logic as well, which says that when you've got one series of dams and the potential for regulating it increases the economic returns to others. But there's also, and this is perhaps the most dangerous, the environmental logics, which is that once you've cut off a migratory fishery with one dam, the incremental impacts of future dams nearby is much less than the first one, and so if one goes ahead, the next one and the next one become increasingly more likely. So these are just some ideas about I guess we're talking about the geopolitics of hydropower development and thinking about a project such as Xayaburi. My own suggestion is that we need to move away from a framework and a set of questions that ask, are countries cooperating, or are they fighting, and rather try to understand the logics in terms of this path dependence, that in fact what's happening now really needs to be understood of the logics of what's happened in future, in part to understand what's happening, but perhaps also to say that if we're looking at river basin governance and management, we have to bite the political bullet, and we need to understand that the decisions we made need to be seen as appropriate or inappropriate, rational or irrational, in terms of what they lead to for future paths. So whatever the arguments are, for example, in the World Bank or the MRC, for the relative impacts of one dam such as Xayaburi, you're never looking at just one dam. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So we have some questions for Phil? Mary.
So for scientists, this is actually pretty discouraging, and it makes me wonder whether one of the roles of science here is really delaying anything happening until after a critical juncture happens in China, after which point the path dependency of all the rest of these logics makes any science outcomes a moot point in making a difference in the region. So how much was spent on the science? 400 million?
Well, that's as of, I think, 1975. So in those dollars right now, you multiply that by, yes.
So it doesn't take a lot of science to know that whether you're going to lose half the fishery or 3/4 of it doesn't really impact the basic lessons. I mean, so we're spending a lot of money on science, I think, that doesn't change the qualitative information that people are using, because what it seems is really happening here is that it's power and money in the region that are driving decision making, and not scientific information, because the decisions being made are being made against the recommendations of the science community. So all this waiting to do science just doesn't seem at all to do anything except allow us to slip past that critical juncture. So I'd be interested in hearing if there is any positive role that you've seen that science could play in making a difference in outcomes.
One of the most constructive roles that I've seen science playing since, in the sort of 20-odd years since I've been working in the Mekong arena, is the knowledge of fisheries, both in terms of the science of fish migrations and so on, but also the understanding of the social significance of fisheries in terms of the size of the catch and so on. And without that, things would have gone a lot further more quickly. This has been fundamental because of the human benefits that come from the fishery. I think, I mean, sort of addressing where I think your question is going, what I'd suggest, and it's sort of very late in the day in somewhere like the Mekong, we're thinking more widely, is perhaps more strategic science, and that's difficult because any science to be credible has to be objective, it has to be sort of seen as objective, but rather that it needs to be done together, ideally, with those who are making decisions, a science that sort of floats on top of the decision making or outside the sort of decision making framework, has less traction, less buy-in. Sometimes not just among the policy making community, but also among NGOs as well. And in Vietnam, the NGOs have been, the sort of nascent NGOs that are emerging there have been particularly effective because they work through the science community in a country where government doesn't listen to communities so much, it listens to its scientists. In Thailand, it's quite different. In Thailand, NGOs are not well engaged with the science community. In fact, there's a distrust of scientists because of the sort of science for sale through EIAs and so on, that are shonky EIAs that have been done. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. You said that more strategic science, but the difficulty with that is that you also want to maintain some level of objectivity. And so I guess I was wondering, do you have any recommendations in terms of how that might actually look? Because it sounds like, from the way I'm imagining as a cynic, is that, okay, well, there are going to be scientists who are employed by NGOs that may say something against what the powers that be want, and the powers that be have their own scientists, and they say whatever, they answer the questions that they paid them to answer. So.
Yeah, no, I mean,
what's the difference is the question.
Yes, I mean, I was just sort of thinking out loud. I guess if there are forums where there's a sort of consensus among different stakeholders, for example, the various forums like the WCD, the World Commission on Dams, or in a much narrower way, this Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Forum. I mean, these are ways in which there has been an attempt to get stakeholders who come from very different, if you like, opposite ends of the spectrum together around a process that then leads to these certain areas of shared understandings. And while they're far from perfect, they're, I guess, a move in the right direction. Yeah.
Let's say that you are Vietnamese, and the raw data is that a construction of a dam would take away 40% of your fishery, the sediment, and so on. What scientific argument from the Western experts, whatever, can you offer the Vietnamese government or the people to say that what does Vietnam has to gain by this, except 6% of more hydropower?
Yeah.
So what? I mean, 40% of the fishery is much more important than 6% hydropower.
Sure.
How would you convince Vietnam to say, it's good for you, but is it truly good for it?
Well, for Vietnam, no, and the Vietnamese government is deeply disturbed by what has happened. But the other side of the equation is that for many years, Vietnam has been building dams on tributaries in the central highlands that flow into Cambodia that have had major impacts on fisheries and sudden flood releases downstream. And so, if you like, from a political moral point of view, Vietnam is in a difficult situation because, while I didn't sort of show this here, Vietnam is both an upstream and a downstream country in the Mekong framework. The other issue has to do with what I call the embedded politics, which is that, of course, Vietnam is concerned about the food production in the Delta as it needs to be, but it's also concerned about losing influence to China. So which set of considerations ultimately come out on top depends on politics, perhaps in the Politburo, at the central decision-making level, which ministries have. Ministry of Foreign Affairs was deeply concerned about the rather sort of aggressive way in which Vietnam was objecting for the very first time to something that its comrade in arms Laos was doing, and so we can look at the illogic of a system like this going ahead, which is destroying so much, and yet you can see the political logics that nevertheless allow it to do so.
What you say, the first argument is having Vietnam taste its own bitter pill of, hey, what you did this to Cambodia, now we're doing this to you. It's not really a scientific argument or an economic argument. What I'm asking you is, what does science have to do to prove to Vietnam that the building of this dam would be good for it economically?
Well, it doesn't, because
So it's obviously for its own survival that it would object to it.
Yes, and yet
how science go around that. It's economy, it's not money, it's not politics.
All the Vietnamese scientists I work with, and particularly in Can Tho, in the Delta, are vehemently opposed to this individual dam and to the project. They're deeply worried. But do they have influence at the relevant level in Hanoi or centrally or through foreign affairs? That's another question. So the science community can find a consensus, but if they're not linked into the political decision-making process, then it goes. So I'm not justifying it. I'm just trying to sort of come up with a framework for explaining why it's so. Please.
This is not exactly about the dams, but it's kind of related. As far as the whole Mekong River Delta, the leftover from defoliation, I don't know, it just, when you talk about fisheries, I guess it's wondering what concentration of
the dioxins,
the 2,4,5-T and stuff like that, whatever's left over. I mean, the whole other thing makes sense in a certain way, but just what's washing the rice paddies into fish and.
Yeah, well, certainly in some of the more heavily affected areas in Long An and other provinces, there's evidence of birth defects in areas where people are growing crops and so on. In terms of the concentration in the rivers, I don't think there's an established correlation there. It'd be extremely difficult to do, I guess.
One more question, and then we'll take the discussion downstairs.
So besides the seasonal flooding and the focus of the dams as that kind of hydrologic control, a lot of the rest of the discussion is on energy development. And what kinds of studies have been done, and that's a very centralized energy source, what kinds of studies have been done to look at decentralized sources of energy that would provide the same type of ability to address increasing energy needs, if this is only going to address 6% of their energy needs by 2030?
That's the mainstream dams would do so. Yeah. I mean, there are experiments all over the region in terms of distributed systems, whether they're solar or small-scale hydro, and a lot of farmers themselves in areas where there hasn't been access to electricity have bought these little 100-watt generators that are produced in China, and they're lovely little things if you have the right topography and so on. But for the most part, certainly in the key country that's developing its economy based on electricity, that is Laos, the commitment is to linking the whole system through the energy grid. And what you find is that in parts of the country which are a long way from the grid, that have either on their own or more often through an external donor-driven project developed their own small hydropower system, it's really an interim measure. And then when the grid comes in, it either becomes defunct, or in some cases, in a very few cases, and there's now the provision for it to sell power back to the grid. But in terms of the total energy mix, it's still very early on, and it comes in part to the economics of reliable power delivery.
Do you have time for a discussion here, just downstairs?
Can I ask one question?
Okay, a quick question, and reminder, we can continue the discussion downstairs in 3006. There's refreshments and plenty of time.
I was struck in the middle of your presentation by what I thought was the key slide of the thing, and that was, what is the Mekong River Commission? Is it a regulator? Is it a government? Is it a scientific agency? What is it? And I wonder if you see, as I do, the correlation or the parallel with Billy Darling, and the fact that as a commission, before sovereign states involved, it was virtually toothless. And once it was nationalized, but in this particular case, there's no national entity to step in and impose governance oversight on this process.
And even in Australia, when the authority was created, it certainly didn't have a buy-in from a very significant part of the basin population. So it's been probably that's right, it doesn't. So now there's a very close connection. The Murray-Darling Agreement informed the Mekong River the Mekong Agreement in 1995 is modelled partly on it, which is another sort of issue. It's to what extent can you take the experience of one basin and sort of transfer it. But at least superficially, there are a lot of parallels with the transboundary issues, the reluctance of the upstream state, in this case Queensland, to come in until later on into the agreement, unlike China doesn't. There's certainly plenty of parallels, and there's an ongoing strategic liaison between the commissions. Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, actually, I've written a little bit on that. I can send you if you like.
Okay, so anybody wants to?